A couple is brutally attacked in their home.
Mobile 911, what's the address of the emergency?
Hey, somebody just got shot.
He had sustained gunshot wounds to the head.
9mm cartridges trailed all the way down to the street.
And she got shot 16 times.
Then he went back to set the house on fire.
Detectives work tirelessly to piece together what happened.
They uncover every stone in order to find the person who did this.
This is a scary person to be running around on the streets.
We have to get answers as quickly as possible.
Then, the case takes a miraculous turn.
I woke up in ICU.
We had a surviving victim.
I remember him shooting me in the streets like a dog.
But will they be able to catch the killer before it's too late?
He told me it was in the mouth.
It's one of the most intentional and pre-planned crimes that I've ever seen as a prosecutor.
I was scared if he was gonna come back to kill me.
I can't imagine anything more terrifying.
They're wondering, are we ever going to see justice?
Hey man, you don't have to.
December 24th, 2021. It's the morning before Christmas in Pritchard, Alabama, a small town of 20,000 just northwest of Mobile.
Pritchard is right on the outskirts of Mobile. It is like Mobile's little sister.
There's a lot of cultures, a lot of diversity.
It's a hidden gem here along the Gulf Coast.
And like anywhere else, the holiday season is a time for peace and goodwill. Which is why what's about to happen will be doubly shocking to local resident Demetrius Jordan.
What the?
Who's thinking that you're gonna hear gunshots on Christmas Eve?
Demetrius runs out on his porch to see what's going on.
He sees this man pointing a gun at this woman who's laying on the ground in broad daylight.
They're in front of his neighbor, Quincy Kemp's house.
Hey! I'm calling the cops!
He yells out he's gonna call the police. The guy runs away.
As the shooter flees, Demetrius runs back inside and grabs his phone.
Mobile 911, what's the address of the emergency?
Hey, somebody just got shot.
"40-year-old Quincy Kemp's first love was music.
He always liked music. That was his safe space. Because whenever he was stressed out or going through something, he would just get out in the yard and he would play.
Quincy was very talented. He played the drums, he played the tuba, he played the trombone, he played the organ, the piano, but his instrument of choice was the trumpet. He played with maybe 3 different bands.
When he got accepted to that band, I got it. I was like, what you got? He said, I tried out for the Olympia band. I tried out for the Port City brass band, and I got into both of them.
He played with the Mardi Gras band, too.
Which was a big deal in Mobile.
There's a definite sense of Mobile pride here, and that pride most often comes up when you start talking about Mardi Gras.
A lot of people don't know, but Mobile is the founder of Mardi Gras. It's not New Orleans. We had it first, and we're very proud of that. We have a lot of fun during the Mardi Gras season, lots of parades.
Nobody does it like us. And we knew when those bands was coming, Quincy was marching.
Unfortunately, Quincy's love life was less fulfilling.
He'd long since split from the mother of his 2 teenage boys.
And he'd recently divorced their stepmother, too.
His divorce was brutal because he wasn't ready to let that go. So he found himself in like a dark, dark place.
He would come to my house and pretty much just cry, like, I don't understand.
I remember like telling him like, you need to leave Mobile. Nothing was really holding him there.
But everything changed when Quincy met Shonda Avery in April of 2021.
I met Quincy, what they call a hit house in Mobile.
A hit house is basically what's known as a juke joint, or a place where people can dance and drink.
Much like Quincy, Shonda was also going through a divorce.
Hey, I'm gonna go to the bathroom. I'll be back.
A girlfriend of mine took me out to get my mind off of things. And lo and behold, Quincy at the bar wanted to buy me a drink. I turned him down. I told him it's okay, because I wasn't really there to meet anybody.
A beautiful woman should never have to pay for her own drinks.
But he would not take no for an answer. So I just give up. I'm letting him buy me a drink.
And once they started talking, they really hit it off.
I guess they clicked and was sharing the same struggles.
People are meant for connection. So in this case, Shonda and Quincy did have similar experiences.
We did exchange numbers that night.
Slowly over the next few months, Shonda and Quincy got to know one another.
We spent a lot of time together. We talked daily. We text all the time.
They'd have lunch, leaning on each other for emotional support.
Quincy picked up the tab when they went to go have dinner, and Quincy called her and he checked on her, and was just something she had never experienced in her life. And that was really special to her.
Quincy was a gentleman. He opened doors. He pulled out chairs. If I was walking on the side of the curb, he'll push me in on the other side of him.
Quincy treated her like a princess.
And by the end of September, they were officially dating.
We enjoyed each other's company. We had fun together.
But now, after Quincy's neighbor called 911 to report a shooting, first responders have arrived outside his house.
Immediately, they see Miss Avery laying down with multiple gunshot wounds.
She's barely breathing, but she's still alive.
While the EMTs work quickly to load her into the ambulance and rush her to the hospital, police head inside to clear the house.
They had no idea what was waiting for them.
They went back to one of the back bedrooms.
They find Quincy on the couch, deceased.
He had sustained a couple of gunshot wounds to the head.
Both on the rebound from failed marriages, it appeared that Shonda Avery and Quincy Kemp had found happiness together.
Shonda was happy that she found somebody like Quincy who, cared for her and showed her love and compassion.
We had fun together. There was never a dull moment with Quincy.
But now, after a neighbor called 911 and reported hearing gunshots, first responders have found Shonda severely wounded on the street in front of Quincy's home.
The EMTs rush her to the hospital.
But there's nothing they can do for Quincy.
He's dead in the house, killed by 2 gunshot wounds to the face.
When detectives arrive, they find the scene is littered with shell casings.
There was 3 9mm shell casings in the bedroom.
And then there were 16 fired 9mm cartridges that trailed from the front doorsteps of that house all the way down to the street.
There are also no signs of forced entry.
You have to wonder, how did the person get in the house? Was it somebody that was familiar with them where they let them in, or was it a breaking and entering type thing?
But then once you start to go through the house, you notice that there aren't any items that have been taken. It clearly suggested that whoever did this knew Shonda and knew Quincy.
This looked like it was a personal attack, a targeted hit.
Who would have such malice intent to want to kill 2 people in cold blood on Christmas Eve?
After looking over the crime scene, detectives turn to Quincy's neighbor, Demetrius Jordan.
He's the one who first called 911.
I woke up to gunshots, and I opened my front door to try to see what was going on.
He says by the time he got out to his porch, Shonda was on the ground.
He was witnessing the shooter standing over Shonda.
he saw him standing over her and then running off.
He stood over Shonda, cocking the gun as if he either jammed up or he was reloading.
But considering the number of shell casings at the scene, detectives believe the gun may have just been empty.
And I said, I'm calling the police. He struck out running.
He was able to give a physical description and also a clothing description.
He had seen an individual with a multicolored hoodie on.
But the 911 caller was not able to say who the assailant was.
He never got a clear look at his face.
But since the shooting happened in broad daylight, detectives hope someone else did. So they go next door.
Another neighbor of Quincy Kemp said earlier that day he had been outside on his back porch and he had noticed that someone was crawling in through the window of Quincy's house.
I seen a guy push that air conditioner right here, and I seen him go in.
Once inside the house, the neighbor says the man put the AC unit back in the window.
They, of course, ask him, why would you not call police if you saw someone committing some type of burglary?
The neighbor said he thought it was somebody Quincy had known.
He like the same guy used to drink and put on the foot. So I thought he had lost it, you know.
He said shortly after the individual removed the AC and went in, that's when Quincy, Shonda, and his father showed up.
I thought everything cool, but the family was out there.
So at that point in time, he says he goes and gets into the shower.
But then a few minutes later, he heard gunshots.
He says he looks out the window and he sees someone running down the road wearing that same multicolored hoodie that he had, seen the individual going into the house.
As detectives finish talking to the neighbor, Quincy's dad pulls up to the scene.
Somebody called me who lived behind Quincy. And remind you, this is a small town. We all grew up here. She was like, they're shooting at your brother's house. And while she's talking, you can hear the shots in the background. Bah, 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 bah. So I called my dad.
His father was nearby when you got a phone call saying that there was a shooting at Quincy's house. And then he went back to the scene.
Speaking with detectives, he's stunned to learn his son is dead.
He said he'd only just left.
Quincy's father actually met him at his house that morning while he was getting a ladder from him to do a job around the corner.
Quincy had done work with his father for years. They worked construction jobs together.
I was going to get the ladder, but Quincy drove up behind me.
Quincy helped his dad load the ladder into the truck. Then his dad took off to go to his job, just a few blocks away.
This guy is literally around the corner with his child being killed.
Although he didn't know that until he'd driven back to Quincy's house, just to make sure everything was okay.
He saw the police personnel and then the crime scene tape up, so that's when things began sinking in with him that Quincy may not be okay.
Asked if he'd gone into the house while he was picking up the ladder, Quincy's dad says no.
He's also pretty sure that Shonda had not gone inside either until he had pulled off.
He says Shonda was there because he thinks she spent the night with Quincy.
And he wasn't very happy about that.
My dad didn't approve of the relationship.
I was telling him to get rid of her.
And when asked why, his answer is simple.
Shonda was still married.
The father of shooting victim Quincy Kemp has just told detectives that Quincy's girlfriend, Shonda Avery, is married.
Shonda, also gravely injured in the shooting, has already been rushed to the hospital.
Quincy's father says that Shonda's husband is a man named Maurice Sashington.
She was going through a divorce, but it has not been finalized.
Has he ever talked about having any type of physical altercation or confrontation with Maurice?
He ain't never been that kind of fella, you know? Right. He wasn't a fighter.
However, he does admit there have been some strange events happening lately.
Someone had thrown gasoline on Quincy's car one night and tried to set it on fire.
The police said must have been somebody weak gas because it didn't do a whole lot of damage.
The fire department said, well, whoever got this gas had water in.
Quincy's dad had also heard that someone had tried to run him off the road.
But Quincy never accused Maurice of being behind any of the incidents.
We all got on the group chat and was like, okay, does this have anything to do with her? And he's like, no, it's not.
That was just hearsay.
But Quincy's dad does say he cautioned his son about dating a married woman.
My dad was not comfortable with Shonda being at the house.
He said he didn't think it was a good idea and that they needed to have a little bit of distance.
In fact, he told his son that messing with a married woman was going to get him hurt.
I was trying to get him straight.
So had his father's prediction proven correct?
Detectives need to talk to their best eyewitness, Shonda.
I felt real bad for her, but I wanted to get all the details from her so I can help put this individual behind bars.
Hoping she can ID the shooter, detectives head to the hospital.
But she's still in surgery.
Shonda's fighting for her life.
She died in the ambulance. She died on the table, and they brought her back.
She got shot 16 times.
Most people that sustain or go through this type of situation do not survive.
So for the time being, there's nothing the detectives can do but go back to the office and run Maurice's name through their system.
He didn't have a terrible, violent history involving criminal charges.
There wasn't anything just completely outlandish to suggest that he was capable of doing something of this nature.
But they do discover that Shonda had taken out a protection order against Maurice shortly before the shooting.
She claimed Maurice had been stalking her.
He would call me, he would text me and let me know that he was sitting outside my house.
The order also showed that Maurice had sent Shonda a series of odd, vaguely threatening texts.
He sent a song by Tupac called Troublesome, and she listened to the song and, she knew that, there could be something to the threats that he was making.
With Maurice now a person of interest in the murder, detectives issue a be on the lookout for him.
The first thing investigators did was try to start apprehending him to get a statement for him.
They went to his house. He wasn't there. They talked to family. They hadn't heard from him in a couple of days.
His family members were uncooperative.
Detectives also head to Alabama State Docks, where Maurice had been working.
We learned that he had just left that job in November, the month leading up to the homicide.
He had gone to pick up a check or something, and no one heard from him for a while.
Did this mean that Maurice had skipped town?
But then, on Christmas Day, the day after Quincy's murder, Mobile County 911 receives another urgent call.
It's from one of Quincy's neighbors.
The fire department was called to extinguish a fire at Quincy's residence.
Detectives investigating Quincy Kemp's murder have just learned that firefighters have been called to a fire at his house.
Not even 24 hours after the shooting took place, on Christmas Day, someone lit the home on fire.
By the time detectives made it to the scene, firefighters had the blaze under control.
Entering the charred bedroom, the detectives immediately suspect arson.
Looking at the area where the fire was started in relation to where the shooting transpired, we knew it was the individual who committed the murder, came back and tried to destroy that area of the house where the crime took place.
I believe that was intentionally done to try to destroy any evidence that may be in the house.
Unfortunately, there was still nothing at the scene that could tie Maurice or anyone to the shooting or the arson.
With Maurice in the wind, Detectives catch a break when several days later they get a call from a supervisor at the docks in nearby Pascagoula, Mississippi.
He stated that he knew Maurice was a person of interest in the case and wanted to give police some info.
He said that Maurice had worked for him the days prior to and just after the murder.
The supervisor says that he hasn't shown up for a couple of days now. However, he has a friend that's a coworker there named Red that is pretty familiar with Maurice and could possibly have more information on his whereabouts.
Detectives head over to Pascagoula to track down Red.
His real name is Jerome Wilson.
And Jerome agrees to speak with detectives.
He said that he knew Maurice from working various dockside jobs with him.
So how long have you known Maurice?
I'd say about 3, maybe 4 years.
He said he'd actually spoken to Maurice about 2 days prior.
He felt very conflicted about the whole situation.
Asked about Shonda, Jerome says Maurice had mentioned that they'd been having problems.
I remember they were going through a divorce.
But to Jerome, it seemed like Maurice had been handling the situation well overall.
He said that it just wasn't going to work out and they both decided to part ways. It was a mutual thing.
So he says he was shocked when he saw on the news that Shonda had been shot and the police were looking for Maurice.
He fooled me, I ain't see that.
He had one idea of who this person was based on who he was at work. And so then to look on the news and see that he's possibly committed a crime such as this, that was moments of disbelief.
It can be very difficult to be the person who is close to someone who commits a crime because you feel like you know a person, and then to find out that they could do something so terrible makes you wonder, do I know anyone?
In fact, Jerome says he was so shocked that he'd actually called Maurice.
Jerome asked, like any friend would, what's going on? What happened?
Like, you know, what they said on the news.
So he admitted that the news was right about him being the guy?
I ain't gonna say he admitted. I ain't gonna say that.
He didn't deny it, though.
I can't tell. No, he didn't deny.
He didn't deny it, and he didn't confirm that he did it.
Jerome tells detectives that Maurice was also cagey with him about where he was headed.
He told me it was in the mouth.
He finishes the conversation by telling Jerome that he's going off the grid, and that was the end of the conversation.
Jerome says that when he tried to call Maurice back again later, he couldn't reach him.
It seemed like he disposed of that phone, didn't want anyone tracking that phone number to be able to find his location.
From Jerome's statement, detectives are now all but certain that Maurice is the man who killed Quincy and shot Shonda 16 times.
But they still can't prove it.
And then the case takes a turn for the good.
Shonda is out of ICU and is able to talk.
Detectives investigating the shooting that killed Quincy Kemp and put his girlfriend Shonda in the hospital have learned that Shonda is finally well enough to give them a statement.
The fact that Shonda miraculously survived was huge for investigators.
Shonda really blessed. God was with her.
Detectives head to the hospital to interview her.
You could tell she was in a lot of pain, but her recollection of the events was as raw as the day it happened.
I recall every moment, every day.
Miss Avery showed a great amount of strength.
Shonda starts out by explaining that she'd been married to Maurice for about 2 years, but they'd known each other far longer.
Maurice and Shonda had been in a kind of on-again, off-again relationship for years.
They share a 4-year-old daughter together.
The beginning of my relationship with Maurice was awesome. You got this puppy love, and you don't want to be away from that person.
But after the birth of their daughter, Shonda says everything changed.
He started drinking a little more than usual. He showed me his true colors after he got the wife and the child.
Shonda said he would just explode and become angry a lot.
He would leave me places when he got drunk. He would embarrass me and cuss me out, but he's never hit me, struck me, pushed me. He gave no indication that he was violent.
But Shonda says their trip to New Orleans in the spring of 2021 was the last straw.
On my birthday, we went to New Orleans, and he got upset. He embarrassed me walking up Bourbon Street and just cussed me out. And I was boohoo not crying in front of hundreds of people.
After that, Shonda filed for divorce.
She told him she didn't want to be with him anymore and that she didn't love him anymore.
Then she met Quincy.
It wasn't until she met Quincy that she realized, I can do better, I deserve better, there's people out there that will treat me better.
I can imagine that it is very difficult to transition from toxicity to health.
It was at this point, she says, that Maurice started stalking her.
It really amplified things when he found out that she had a relationship developing with Quincy.
This is also when he started sending her violent messages.
He would call me, he would text me and let me know that he was sitting outside my house. That's when I put the protective order in for him to stay away.
She had trespassed him from her home. She had filed for divorce. She had done everything that she could to distance herself from this.
She says that he responded with death threats against her and Quincy.
I thought he was just blowing off steam. I would never have imagined in a million years that he was capable of doing something like this.
When questioning turns to the day of the shooting, Shonda tells detectives she is sure it was Maurice that pulled the trigger.
What I need you to do on my quarter right here, I need you to tell me who exactly shot you.
Is it on?
Yeah, it's on. You can talk to him.
Okay. Oh, Maurice Sessions was shot.
Then she walks them through what happened.
I spent the night over Quincy's.
That next morning on Christmas Eve, she said they ran to the store and came back to the house.
Then Quincy had just pulled back up from coming from the store, and his dad was already there.
My dad came over to say, no, give me the ladder.
They had some small talk outside.
And we got the ladder for his father.
Quincy got the ladder and put it on his father's truck, and then the father left Quincy's residence, and Quincy and Shonda went inside Quincy's house.
According to Shonda, they went back to the bedroom where Quincy sat down on the couch.
Hey, have you seen my cigars?
And when I looked up, that's when I see Maurice.
He had a gun. He had it pointed right at Quincy's head.
It was frightening.
Quincy was sitting on his couch. He was defenseless.
Maurice! No! Shonda hollered his name. I know for a fact that my brother was terrified.
And so was Shonda.
I was scared out of my mind. That's when I ran.
She ran for her life.
But she knew what happened next.
Shonda said that she heard Quincy's last words.
Man, you'll have to...
Maurice shot him, boom, boom, 2 times in the face.
She heard Quincy being murdered, and she couldn't even process what was happening.
It was so much adrenaline. She said she ain't feel herself go down the steps.
And then Maurice went outside to shoot Shonda.
She described it to me. She just felt her legs go limp, and she felt herself falling to the ground.
When she got to the street, she lost consciousness.
Did Maurice come and stand over you or anything?
I remember that.
Okay. But you pretty much, for certain, Maurice shot you?
Oh, yeah. That was Maurice. That's all I remember until I woke up in ICU. But I do remember that Maurice was the one that shot me and Quincy. I remember him shooting me in the streets like a dog.
I believe that he thought she was dead. And it's honestly a miracle that she wasn't. It's one of the most intentional and pre-planned crimes that I've ever seen as a prosecutor. And it makes it especially egregious considering it was Christmas Eve when it all happened.
But what detectives needed to know now is Maurice's whereabouts.
Ever since Jerome Red Wilson had told them Maurice had gone off the grid, every effort to find him had failed.
When there's someone who murdered a man, basically executed him after breaking into his home and then shot his ex 16 times, that's a scary person to be running around on the streets.
The whole town of Mobile, Alabama is on edge because no one knows where this killer is.
I didn't know where he was, didn't know if he was gonna come back to kill me, finish the job, didn't know if he was gonna hurt my loved ones, Quincy's loved ones.
It was an emotional roller coaster. I remember for myself just feeling so much anxiety. Every day I couldn't sleep.
Then, after 5 agonizing months, detectives get a new lead when an old source reaches out.
Homicide?
Jerome Red Wilson gets a call from a random number, and that person that's calling him is none other than Maurice Sashington.
And according to Jerome, Maurice had given him a clue about where he was hiding out.
He said something about meeting him in Las Vegas.
After 5 frustrating months of trying to bring Maurice Sashington to justice for the shooting that left his estranged wife Shonda critically injured and killed her boyfriend Quincy Kemp, detectives finally have a lead on the fugitive.
Homicide?
According to his friend Jerome Wilson, Maurice had called him a couple of days ago and asked if they could meet up in Vegas.
When we spoke with Red, he mentioned that he was somewhere outside Las Vegas in that area.
Jerome says at first he had no idea it was Maurice calling him.
There wasn't no number I was familiar with.
But it soon became clear once Jerome picked up the call.
In that conversation, Maurice is telling him he's in the mountains near Vegas now, ways away from Mobile, Alabama.
But then he also told Jerome, anyone who tells on me is going to have problems.
I mean, I took that as a threat.
Despite that, Jerome went ahead and spoke with detectives, giving them Maurice's new phone number.
Red's decision to give up essentially his friend was a very difficult one to have to make. The idea of either keeping myself safe or keeping someone else safe was at hand here.
Using the new cell phone number, detectives are able to pinpoint Maurice's location.
They were able to trace that phone out to the remote area in Las Vegas, Nevada. We knew that we had to act on that fast.
Once we got a location of where he was staying, we reached out to the field office in Las Vegas.
We found Maurice Sashington living out of his vehicle with a bunch of burner phones.
He was trying to make it to Mexico, and they got him.
Hey, sideways for the feet. For the feet more. All the way. Bring your right foot inside. There you go. Quit moving around. Just face the truck, bro. You're all worked up. Relax.
As soon as the detectives hear that Maurice has finally been captured, they fly out to Las Vegas to question him.
But the trip turns out to be a waste.
Plan was going to talk to you, but you don't want to talk to us. See?
Not without a lawyer, Brandon.
But regardless, Maurice is extradited to Alabama to face the charges.
Once the news broke that Maurice was apprehended, you could really sense this wave of relief and calming emotion really go over the community.
The detective called me and was like, Tosh, we got him. I was like, what? Like, we got him. I was shouting. I was like, thank you, Lord.
My sister Tasha called me and she was just screaming, they got him, they got him, they got him. And I was just like, oh my God, I had to pull over my car. And we prayed and we cried and we gave God thanks. And then I called Shonda and then we were just so excited that they got him.
He was no longer a harm or danger to anybody else.
Still, Quincy's family doesn't just want a conviction. They want him punished to the maximum extent of the law.
We were going for the death penalty.
But when Maurice stands trial in May of 2024, prosecutors decide not to seek the death penalty.
We do have the death penalty in Alabama. We save the death penalty for the absolute worst of the worst. This murder was really an isolated incident in Maurice's life. He had lived most of his adult life without really any issues at all. So we felt that the appropriate punishment would be life without the possibility of parole.
And the prosecutors are confident they can get it.
We had physical evidence, we had eyewitness testimony, we had evidence of flight.
But most of all, they have Shonda, who takes the stand and tells the jury how Maurice killed Quincy, shot her 16 times, and left her for dead.
Trials are always gut-wrenching, and our evidence has to come from the witnesses. We can't ask the officer to tell the jury what Shonda said. Shonda has to be able to do that. There's a lot of people that will not come forward. They won't follow through with what needs to be done to ultimately get justice. And that's something that Shonda did.
My experience with the trial was emotional. Having to relive everything. Having to see him every day. Having to look at his emotionless face. He said nothing. He sat there, just a blank face. It was a lot to take in.
He's a monster.
She is one of the strongest people that I have ever met. She was brave, she was courageous, and she got up there and she told every single bit of it.
When it's the defense's turn, they try to counter Shonda's testimony the only way they can, by calling her a liar.
They argued that she was trying to pin the shooting on her estranged husband out of spite.
But in the end, Shonda's testimony against her would-be killer makes all the difference.
All 12 jurors agreed beyond a reasonable doubt that he was guilty of attempted murder, and he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
The sentence doesn't go far enough for some of Quincy's family.
My sisters, they kept telling me, a win is a win, but I still don't think justice was served.
If he would have got that death penalty, I would have felt a whole lot better. Life and just being in jail, that's easy way out.
However, Maurice isn't the only one still paying the price for what he's done.
I continually pray for Shonda. She's had multiple surgeries. Even though she lived to tell the story, she has to deal with this every day. It's constant pain.
I get my strength from my children, from Quincy's family, for supporting me this whole time.
But it was Quincy who paid the ultimate price.
My brother was an outstanding guy. He was a man's man. He took care of his kids. He raised them to be good, godly men. He didn't deserve that.
Love on your family. That's all I can tell you. Just love on your family, because one day they're here, the next day they're gone. And you can't bring them back.
Arthur Shawcross was not the kind of man who inspired fear at first glance. He did not command attention when he entered a room, nor did he fit the popular image of a calculating mastermind hiding behind extraordinary intelligence. To most people who crossed his path, he appeared remarkably ordinary, a middle-aged laborer living a quiet life in Rochester, New York. He held routine jobs, maintained a marriage, drove familiar streets, and blended almost perfectly into the rhythm of everyday American life. Yet beneath that ordinary exterior existed a man who had already killed before. A man who had been released after serving only 14 years for crimes against children, and a man who would become responsible for one of the deadliest serial murder cases in New York State history. His story is not simply the story of a serial killer. It is also the story of institutional failure, forgotten victims, and the devastating consequences of believing that some violent offenders can be safely returned to society despite clear warning signs. By the time investigators finally arrested Arthur Shawcross in January 1990, 12 women had disappeared or been found dead around Rochester. Many of their bodies abandoned near the Genesee River or in isolated wooded areas. Their disappearances had stretched across nearly 2 years, but for much of that time, few people realized that a serial killer was hunting among them. Many of the victims lived on the margins of society. Several struggled with drug addiction. Many relied on prostitution to survive. Some had unstable housing or lived transient lives that delayed missing person reports. Those circumstances unintentionally created the conditions that allowed the murders to continue far longer than they might have otherwise. Families searched for daughters, sisters, and mothers while investigators attempted to determine whether the deaths were connected or merely tragic coincidences. The Genesee River, which winds through Rochester before flowing north into Lake Ontario, gradually became an unwilling witness. Bodies were recovered along its banks, beneath bridges, near wooded trails, and in isolated ravines. Some victims had remained exposed to the elements for days or weeks before discovery. Rain, wildlife, and natural decomposition destroyed valuable forensic evidence, making every investigation more difficult than the last. As the number of victims increased, so too did the fear spreading quietly through Rochester. But the city did not immediately recognize the threat. At first, investigators confronted each homicide individually. The victims appeared to share certain lifestyles, yet their disappearances occurred over many months and across different jurisdictions. Without immediate forensic links or eyewitnesses capable of identifying the attacker, detectives struggled to establish a clear pattern. Only later would they realize that the similarities were impossible to ignore. A single predator had been moving through the city with disturbing confidence. Newspapers eventually gave him a name that would become permanently associated with one of New York's darkest criminal investigations, the Genesee River Killer. Yet that title, dramatic as it sounds, tells only part of the story. Long before Rochester learned to fear Arthur Shawcross, another community had already experienced unimaginable tragedy. Nearly 16 years earlier, 2 children had been murdered. Those crimes should have ensured that Shawcross never again walked free. Instead, weaknesses within the criminal justice system allowed him another opportunity, and the consequences would prove catastrophic. Looking back today, investigators, criminologists, and legal scholars often point to the Shawcross case as one of the most significant examples of parole failure in modern American criminal justice. The warning signs had existed. Psychological concerns had been raised. His previous crimes had involved extreme violence against vulnerable victims. Nevertheless, after serving approximately 14 years of a maximum 25-year sentence, Shawcross was granted parole in 1987. Officials believed he had demonstrated acceptable behavior in prison. He had completed rehabilitation programs and was considered suitable for release. His criminal history was effectively hidden from the new community where he settled, allowing him to begin another life with relatively little public scrutiny. He remarried, obtained ordinary employment, and settled into Rochester. Outwardly, nothing suggested that one of America's future serial killers had quietly arrived in the city. Understanding Arthur Shawcross requires separating documented fact from his own often unreliable statements. Throughout numerous interviews after his arrest, He offered contradictory explanations about nearly every aspect of his life. He claimed that his mother abused him. He alleged that he had been bullied throughout childhood. He even accused his sister of sexually abusing him. Yet family members either denied these allegations or stated they could not confirm them. Investigators who spent years examining his background concluded that Shawcross frequently exaggerated, altered, or entirely fabricated personal stories. The same pattern appeared repeatedly during his later confessions, where he constantly shifted motives and attempted to justify or minimize his actions. Because of this, many of the most sensational stories associated with Shawcross cannot be accepted as established fact. What remains reliable are official records. Arthur John Shawcross was born on June 6, 1945 in Kittery, Maine, before spending most of his childhood in Watertown, New York. School and military records describe a young man who struggled socially, demonstrated aggressive tendencies, lied frequently, and experienced unstable relationships with women. None of these characteristics alone predicted that he would become a serial murderer, but together they formed part of a troubling behavioral pattern. In 1967, he entered military service and served in Vietnam in a logistics role. Years later, Shawcross attempted to portray himself as a battle-hardened combat veteran responsible for numerous wartime killings. However, military documentation failed to support many of those dramatic claims. Researchers examining his service record concluded that much of what he described either could not be verified or directly contradicted official records. This distinction is important because Shawcross often used these stories to explain or excuse his crimes. Investigators, however, refused to accept unsupported narratives in place of evidence. Evidence would ultimately become the defining challenge throughout the Shawcross investigation. The murders committed in Rochester left limited forensic traces because of environmental exposure. Years earlier, evidence had posed an even greater obstacle when 2 children became his first confirmed victims. Those early investigations occurred during a period when forensic science lacked many of the techniques available today. DNA testing was unavailable, biological evidence often deteriorated before analysis, and prosecutors frequently relied upon witness testimony and circumstantial evidence. These limitations would shape every legal decision that followed and eventually influence one of the most controversial parole outcomes in American criminal history. Before Arthur Shawcross became known as the Genesee River Killer, before the bodies discovered along the riverbanks terrified an entire city, before helicopters circled above frozen woodlands searching for clues, he had already crossed a line from which there could be no return. 2 children lost their lives in 1972, and despite the horror of those crimes, the legal outcome left open the possibility that their killer might one day walk free again. That decision would echo across the following decades. The next chapter of this story begins not in Rochester, but in Jefferson County, New York, where 2 families searching desperately for missing children could not have imagined that the man responsible would eventually become one of America's most notorious serial killers. Their tragedy marked the beginning of a chain of events that would ultimately claim 14 confirmed lives and expose painful questions about justice, rehabilitation, and the cost of getting those judgments catastrophically wrong. After receiving a maximum sentence of 25 years for the 1972 crimes, Arthur Shawcross disappeared behind prison walls. For the families of Jack Owen Blake and Karen and Hill, there could be no true sense of closure. A conviction had been secured, but the legal outcome left lingering questions that would only grow louder with time. 2 children had been sexually assaulted and murdered, yet the man responsible had not been convicted of first-degree murder. The plea agreement reflected the limitations prosecutors faced during the early 1970s rather than any lack of seriousness surrounding the crimes. Physical evidence in Jack Blake's case had deteriorated after months in the wilderness, and forensic science had not yet reached the level of sophistication that later generations would consider routine. Prosecutors feared that taking the case to trial on more serious charges carried the risk of acquittal. Faced with that uncertainty, They accepted a plea to manslaughter involving Karen and Hill's death, believing that securing a guaranteed conviction was preferable to risking no conviction at all. Legally, the decision made sense within the circumstances of the time. Historically, however, it would become one of the most criticized decisions associated with the Shawcross case. During his incarceration, Shawcross lived a life largely removed from public attention. Correctional officials observed his conduct over the years, recording his behavior within the controlled environment of prison. Reports later indicated that he generally complied with institutional rules and participated in rehabilitation programs made available to inmates. Such records became important because parole boards often evaluate not only the original crime, but also the offender's conduct while imprisoned. To many correctional officials, years of acceptable behavior suggested the possibility that rehabilitation had occurred. Yet prison presents a unique environment. Every aspect of daily life is structured, monitored, and restricted. Opportunities for violent offending are dramatically reduced compared with life outside prison walls. Critics of the parole process would later argue that good institutional behavior alone cannot reliably predict how an individual will behave once freedom, opportunity, and access to vulnerable victims are restored. The Shawcross case would become a powerful example of that debate. Mental health evaluations added another layer of complexity. According to later accounts, some professionals who examined Shawcross warned that he displayed characteristics associated with psychopathy and represented a continuing danger. Such assessments did not automatically determine parole decisions, nor did every evaluator necessarily reach identical conclusions. Nevertheless, the existence of warnings would become deeply significant after his release. In retrospect, many observers questioned whether sufficient weight had been given to concerns about the potential risk he still posed. The central issue was not whether rehabilitation programs had been completed or whether prison rules had been followed. Instead, the question became whether someone who had sexually assaulted and murdered 2 children could truly be considered no longer dangerous simply because years had passed without further violence inside a tightly controlled institution. By 1987, approximately 14 years after entering prison, Shawcross became eligible for parole. Officials reviewing his case considered multiple factors, including his institutional record and perceived readiness to return to society. Ultimately, the parole board concluded that he could be released. The decision reflected confidence that he had been rehabilitated sufficiently to live safely within the community. With that decision, one of the most consequential chapters in the story quietly began. At the time of his release, few people outside official circles knew much about Arthur Shawcross. His criminal history did not follow him in the way many modern observers might expect. After leaving prison, he relocated to Rochester, New York, rather than returning to the community most closely associated with his earlier crimes. His previous record was effectively sealed from widespread public awareness, reducing the likelihood that neighbors or employers would recognize the history behind the seemingly ordinary middle-aged man settling into their city. Shawcross remarried and attempted to establish a stable routine. He found ordinary employment and blended into everyday life with remarkable ease. To those who interacted with him casually, he appeared unremarkable. He did not project the image of a notorious criminal. He was neither especially charismatic nor outwardly intimidating. This ability to appear ordinary would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Many serial offenders rely not on elaborate disguises, but on society's expectation that extraordinary violence must be committed by extraordinary people. Shawcross challenged that assumption simply by looking like everyone else. While his new life unfolded, Rochester itself continued functioning as a busy city in western New York. The Genesee River cut through the landscape, shaping neighborhoods, parks, bridges, and wooded areas before continuing north toward Lake Ontario. Thousands of people crossed its bridges each day without imagining that the river would soon become associated with one of the state's most infamous serial murder investigations. Like many American cities during the late 1980s, Rochester faced social challenges that affected some of its most vulnerable residents. Among those living on the margins were women struggling with addiction, homelessness, unstable housing, or prostitution. Many depended upon street-based sex work as a means of survival. Their daily routines required entering vehicles driven by strangers, often with little opportunity to assess potential danger. These circumstances did not diminish their humanity or the value of their lives, but they did create vulnerabilities that predators could exploit. Investigators would later conclude that Shawcross deliberately targeted women whose disappearances might not immediately trigger extensive missing person investigations. This pattern reflected opportunity rather than coincidence. Families sometimes lost contact with loved ones for days or weeks because addiction, unstable housing, or transient lifestyles interrupted regular communication. As a result, disappearances were not always recognized immediately as evidence of serious crime. Delayed reporting complicated police investigations and reduced the chances of preserving fresh forensic evidence. At the time, however, no one recognized that a pattern was beginning to emerge. Only about a year after his release, women involved in prostitution began disappearing around Rochester. Initially, the incidents appeared isolated. Law enforcement agencies investigated individual cases as they arose, but without clear forensic connections or eyewitness testimony identifying a common suspect. The broader picture remained obscured. Some bodies would eventually be discovered in isolated wooded areas, near streams, beneath bridges, or along the banks of the Genesee River. Exposure to weather, wildlife, and the passage of time frequently damaged or destroyed evidence before investigators arrived. Every delayed discovery made reconstruction of events more difficult. Forensic specialists faced significant obstacles in determining precise timelines, recovering biological evidence, or identifying consistent signatures linking the crimes together. The environment itself became an unintended ally for the killer, erasing clues with every passing day. As months passed, the number of victims steadily increased. Women disappeared one after another, many sharing similar backgrounds marked by economic hardship, addiction, or life on the streets. Yet because the cases unfolded gradually and involved victims from marginalized circumstances, recognizing a serial pattern proved challenging. Investigators could not simply assume every homicide or disappearance belonged to the same offender. Each case demanded independent examination before meaningful connections could be established. Meanwhile, the man responsible continued living what appeared to be an ordinary existence. Arthur Shawcross drove familiar roads, worked regular jobs, returned home after each day, and attracted little attention from those around him. His past remained largely hidden, while his future victims unknowingly crossed paths with someone who had already demonstrated a capacity for extreme violence years earlier. Looking back, the period immediately following Shawcross's release represents one of the clearest illustrations of how institutional decisions can carry consequences far beyond the courtroom. The parole board believed it had released a rehabilitated man. Instead, Rochester had unknowingly become home to a repeat killer whose most infamous crimes were still ahead. The disappearances that began in 1988 would gradually transform local concern into one of New York's largest serial murder investigations, forcing detectives to confront a chilling possibility. The man responsible had not learned to live peacefully after prison. He had simply been given another opportunity. By early 1988, Arthur Shawcross had been living in Rochester for roughly a year. On the surface, his life appeared settled. He had remarried, held ordinary jobs, and blended into the routines of the community. To those around him, he seemed like an average middle-aged man attempting to rebuild his life after years in prison. His neighbors saw nothing that suggested the violence hidden beneath that ordinary appearance. The criminal record that might have caused alarm was no longer widely known in his new community, and few people had any reason to connect him with the murders of 2 children committed more than a decade earlier. while Shawcross adapted to his new surroundings. Another reality was unfolding on the streets of Rochester. Women who survived through prostitution continued to work in neighborhoods where meeting strangers was an unavoidable part of daily life. Many struggled with addiction, unstable housing, or homelessness. Their circumstances often placed them in dangerous situations, requiring them to enter unfamiliar vehicles with little opportunity to judge the intentions of the people behind the wheel. These women were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends, but their lives frequently unfolded beyond the attention of wider society. Investigators would later conclude that Shawcross deliberately chose victims from this vulnerable population, recognizing that disappearances might not immediately trigger urgent searches or widespread public concern. Around March 1988, women began disappearing. At first, each case seemed isolated. A missing woman might be assumed to have moved elsewhere, entered treatment, stayed with acquaintances, or simply lost contact with family members. For individuals whose lives were already marked by instability, temporary disappearances were unfortunately not uncommon. This reality complicated every investigation. Detectives could not immediately distinguish between voluntary absences and potential homicide. As valuable hours and days passed, opportunities to preserve evidence gradually disappeared. According to the investigation, Shawcross followed a relatively consistent method of selecting victims. He drove through areas of Rochester where prostitution was common, searching for women willing to enter his vehicle. The initial encounters often appeared routine. He would stop, negotiate payment, and offer transportation to a more secluded location. Nothing about those first moments necessarily suggested immediate danger. Several women who had encountered Shawcross but survived later described him as calm and polite. During the early stages of contact, he did not initially rely on threats or obvious intimidation. Instead, he exploited familiarity, presenting himself as another customer among many. That appearance of normality became one of his greatest advantages. Once isolated from public view, however, the situation changed completely. Investigators determined that Shawcross either engaged in sexual activity or created the appearance of a routine transaction before attacking. The cause of death in the confirmed murders was primarily strangulation. Evidence indicated that he used his hands or, in some instances, another form of ligature to compress the victims' necks until they died from asphyxiation. Unlike crimes driven by firearms or sudden violence, strangulation requires sustained physical contact between offender and victim. It is an intensely personal form of homicide that demands continued force over an extended period. After death, investigators concluded that Shawcross committed acts of sexual abuse against some victims' bodies before disposing of them. The official investigation documented these post-mortem assaults without attributing consistent motives to them, particularly because Shawcross repeatedly altered his explanations during later interviews. Rather than accepting his changing stories, investigators relied upon physical evidence and forensic findings to establish what had occurred. After completing the murders, Shawcross transported or dragged the victims' bodies into remote locations. The Genesee River became central to his disposal strategy. Bodies were abandoned along riverbanks, beneath bridges, within wooded areas, near ravines, and beside streams feeding into the river system. These locations shared one important characteristic. They were isolated enough to delay discovery while remaining accessible by vehicle. The natural environment itself contributed to the destruction of evidence. Rainfall washed away trace materials. Wildlife disturbed remains. Seasonal changes accelerated decomposition. Every day that passed before discovery reduced investigators' ability to recover biological evidence or reconstruct precise timelines. The river did not conceal the truth forever, but it delayed its discovery long enough for additional victims to disappear. As more bodies were recovered, investigators gradually recognized similarities that could no longer be ignored. Most victims were women between approximately 20 and 35 years old. Many had histories of drug addiction or homelessness. Most had engaged in prostitution. The combination of these shared characteristics suggested that someone was specifically targeting women whose daily circumstances left them especially vulnerable. Still, linking every case remained difficult. Bodies were recovered in different jurisdictions, requiring cooperation among multiple investigative agencies. Evidence varied from one scene to another because environmental conditions differed. Some remains had been exposed for extended periods before discovery, while others were found sooner. The lack of immediate forensic connections initially slowed recognition that a single offender might be responsible. During this period, the names of the victims slowly accumulated within investigative files. Dorothy Blackburn became one of the women whose death would later be attributed to Shawcross. She was followed by Anna Marie Steffen, Dorothy Keeler, Patricia Ives, June Stott, Marie Welch, Frances Brown, Kimberly Logan, Elizabeth Gibson, Darlene Trippi, June Cicero, and Felicia Stevens. Each name represented a separate investigation, a separate family, and a separate life abruptly ended. Too often, public attention focused primarily on the offender while overlooking the women whose lives had been taken. Modern examinations of the Shawcross case increasingly emphasize the importance of remembering the victims individually rather than viewing them merely as statistics within a serial murder investigation. One case stood apart because of particularly disturbing forensic findings. The body of June Stott displayed injuries not observed in most of the other murders. Investigators documented a large incision extending from the pelvic region toward the chest after death. The unusual nature of this post-mortem mutilation attracted significant attention during the investigation and later in court. When questioned about June Stott's death, Shawcross offered multiple explanations that shifted over time. He attempted to justify or reinterpret his actions in different ways, but investigators regarded these statements with considerable skepticism. Throughout the investigation, Shawcross repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to alter his stories, exaggerate events, or invent explanations that conflicted with established evidence. Consequently, law enforcement relied upon documented forensic findings rather than his evolving narratives when reconstructing the crime. By the latter part of 1989, the accumulation of victims forced investigators to reconsider earlier assumptions. The possibility that Rochester faced an active serial killer became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Detectives began comparing evidence across jurisdictions more systematically, searching for patterns that might identify the offender before additional women disappeared. They recognized that the similarities extended beyond victim characteristics. The methods of killing, the disposal locations near waterways and wooded areas, and the timing of the disappearances suggested a common perpetrator operating with growing confidence. Public concern intensified as additional discoveries were made. Although many details remained unknown, investigators understood that they were no longer confronting isolated homicides. They were attempting to identify an offender who had successfully avoided detection while repeatedly targeting vulnerable women across the Rochester area. Every passing week raised the possibility that another victim might already be missing. The investigation entered a new phase, shifting from individual homicide inquiries toward a coordinated effort to stop a serial killer before he could strike again. Detectives expanded cooperation across agencies, increased surveillance around locations where bodies had previously been discovered, and devoted greater resources to identifying suspicious activity near the Genesee River. Unknown to them, those intensified efforts were gradually narrowing the search. Arthur Shawcross continued believing he had escaped suspicion, driving the same roads and living the same outwardly ordinary life that had protected him for nearly 2 years. But the pattern he had created was becoming impossible to ignore. The river that had hidden so much evidence had also left behind enough connections for investigators to recognize that they were hunting one man. The next challenge would be finding him before another family lost someone they loved. By the closing months of 1989, Investigators in Rochester were no longer treating the growing number of homicide cases as unrelated tragedies. The similarities had become too significant to dismiss. Women sharing comparable backgrounds were disappearing under similar circumstances, and their bodies were being recovered in locations connected by waterways, wooded areas, and isolated terrain surrounding the Genesee River. Although each crime scene presented unique forensic challenges, the cumulative evidence increasingly suggested that a single offender was responsible. Detectives understood that every day without an arrest increased the likelihood that another woman would become a victim. The investigation therefore shifted from solving individual murders to identifying and stopping an active serial killer. Law enforcement agencies expanded cooperation across jurisdictions because several bodies had been discovered in different counties. Earlier investigations had often been limited by geographical boundaries, with detectives naturally concentrating on crimes occurring within their own areas of responsibility. As more victims were identified, however, investigators began systematically comparing reports, forensic findings, timelines, and victim profiles. While environmental conditions had destroyed much physical evidence, broader patterns gradually emerged. Most victims had been involved in prostitution, many struggled with addiction or unstable housing, and several had disappeared after being seen in areas where street-based sex work was common. These common elements strengthened the belief that the offender deliberately selected women whose disappearances might not immediately trigger extensive investigations. Detectives also recognized that the disposal sites followed a noticeable pattern. Bodies repeatedly appeared near the Genesee River, adjacent streams, wooded ravines, bridges, and isolated natural areas accessible by vehicle. The location suggested familiarity with the region rather than random selection. Whoever committed the murders appeared comfortable navigating these areas and confident that the environment would delay discovery. Unfortunately for investigators, that assumption often proved correct. Exposure to weather, flowing water, wildlife, and natural decomposition significantly reduced the amount of usable forensic evidence available from many scenes. Fingerprints, biological material, and trace evidence were frequently absent or too degraded for meaningful analysis. Without modern DNA techniques capable of overcoming such limitations, detectives relied heavily upon surveillance, witness interviews, victimology, and careful observation of offender behavior. Recognizing that the offender repeatedly returned to similar environments, investigators adopted a more proactive strategy. Rather than waiting for another body to be discovered before beginning the next investigation, police increased surveillance around locations where victims had previously been abandoned. Patrols were intensified near isolated riverbanks, wooded access roads, and areas frequently associated with prostitution. Officers spent long hours observing locations where they believed the offender might eventually return. Helicopter support also became part of the operation, allowing investigators to monitor remote terrain more effectively than ground patrols alone. These efforts reflected an important shift in investigative thinking. Detectives no longer viewed themselves as responding solely to completed crimes. Instead, they were attempting to interrupt the offender before another murder occurred. During the first days of January 1990, those efforts began producing results. Between January 3rd and January 5th, police surveillance focused on an area where a victim's body had recently been discovered. Investigators believed there was a possibility that the offender might revisit locations connected with earlier crimes, either to observe police activity or for reasons known only to himself. While monitoring the area, a police helicopter observed a man behaving suspiciously near the location where the latest body had been found. The observation immediately attracted attention because very few legitimate reasons existed for someone to be present in such an isolated area connected to an active homicide investigation. Ground surveillance units quickly became involved. Detectives observed the individual and documented the vehicle associated with him. rather than making an immediate arrest without sufficient information. Investigators carefully gathered identifying details. The vehicle's license plate became a critical piece of evidence. Once recorded, officers traced the registration through official records. The results identified the owner as Arthur John Shawcross. At that stage, detectives began examining Shawcross far more closely. As they reviewed available information, his background immediately stood out. He had previously been convicted in connection with the killings of 2 children during 1972 and had been released on parole approximately 14 years into a maximum 25-year sentence. The realization was striking. The individual now appearing near the scene of another homicide already possessed a documented history of extreme violence involving vulnerable victims. Although investigators still required evidence sufficient to support an arrest and prosecution, Shawcross rapidly became the primary suspect. On January 5, 1990, law enforcement officers arrested Arthur Shawcross. The arrest marked the end of nearly 2 years during which women had continued disappearing across Rochester. Yet the investigation itself was far from complete. Detectives still needed to establish Shawcross's responsibility for the murders through evidence capable of surviving courtroom scrutiny. During the initial stages of questioning, Shawcross denied involvement. Such denials were not unusual in major homicide investigations, particularly when suspects understood the seriousness of the charges they faced. Investigators therefore relied on patient, methodical interviewing rather than expecting an immediate confession. They confronted Shawcross with information gathered throughout the investigation, carefully comparing his statements against independently verified facts. Gradually, the interviews began producing significant admissions. One particularly important development involved jewelry belonging to one of the victims. Investigators learned that Shawcross had given a piece of a victim's jewelry to his girlfriend. That discovery established a direct connection between Shawcross and property associated with one of the murdered women. Although the jewelry alone did not explain every homicide, it strengthened the case considerably by demonstrating possession of an item linked to a victim after her disappearance. Faced with accumulating evidence, Shawcross eventually confessed to most of the murders. His formal statement extended to nearly 80 pages, providing investigators with substantial information regarding the crimes. He also led authorities to locations associated with some victims whose remains had not yet been recovered or whose disposal sites required clarification. These admissions represented major breakthroughs, allowing detectives to confirm aspects of the investigation that had previously remained uncertain. Nevertheless, investigators approached Shawcross's statements with caution. Throughout the interviews, he repeatedly changed his explanations regarding motive and responsibility. At various times, he attempted to blame circumstances beyond his control, suggested that the victims themselves had somehow contributed to the violence, or claimed he had temporarily lost control of his actions. These shifting narratives created a familiar pattern that investigators had already observed when examining earlier claims about his childhood and military service. Because Shawcross frequently altered his stories or made statements inconsistent with established facts, detectives refused to rely solely upon his own descriptions of events. Instead, they compared every significant claim against physical evidence, witness testimony, and documented investigative findings. This careful approach proved essential. A confession, while powerful, does not automatically resolve every question in a criminal investigation. Reliable prosecutions depend upon corroborated evidence rather than unsupported statements made by the accused. Investigators therefore distinguish between facts independently verified through the investigation and explanations offered only by Shawcross himself. This distinction would remain important during the later court proceedings, particularly when the defense attempted to portray him as someone whose psychological condition diminished his criminal responsibility. By the conclusion of the interrogation process, however, one central fact had become unmistakably clear. The pattern that detectives had spent months identifying was real. The disappearances were connected. The bodies found near the Genesee River and surrounding areas had not been abandoned by multiple unrelated offenders. They were the work of one man who had previously been convicted of killing children, had been released after serving only part of his sentence, and had resumed killing within approximately a year of regaining his freedom. With Shawcross now in custody and extensive evidence assembled, the investigation entered its final stage. The focus shifted from identifying the killer to presenting a case capable of demonstrating his guilt before a jury. The upcoming trial would not only determine Arthur Shawcross's legal fate, but would also force the justice system to confront difficult questions about parole, mental health evaluations, institutional responsibility, and the devastating consequences that followed when a man once judged safe enough to release committed another series of murders that claimed even more innocent lives. The arrest of Arthur Shawcross on January 5, 1990, brought an immediate sense of relief to investigators who had spent months attempting to identify the person responsible for the deaths of numerous women around Rochester. Yet an arrest alone could not deliver justice. Detectives had assembled a substantial body of evidence, but every element would now be examined in court under the scrutiny of prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and ultimately a jury. The challenge before the prosecution was not simply to demonstrate that Shawcross had confessed. They also needed to establish that he was legally responsible for his actions and that the evidence supported convictions beyond a reasonable doubt. Given the complexity of the investigation, the varying locations of the crimes, and the degraded condition of many crime scenes, preparing the case required careful organization of forensic findings, witness testimony, investigative records, and Shawcross's own statements. One important aspect of the prosecution involved distinguishing between verified facts and the many contradictory stories Shawcross told after his arrest. Throughout the lengthy interrogation process, his explanations frequently shifted. At times, he attempted to portray himself as someone overwhelmed by forces beyond his control. On other occasions, he suggested that particular circumstances or even the victims themselves somehow contributed to the violence. Investigators had already become familiar with this pattern while examining his earlier claims about childhood abuse and military service, many of which either could not be confirmed or conflicted with official records. As a result, prosecutors approached Shawcross's statements cautiously. Rather than relying upon his changing narratives to explain motive, they focused on evidence that could be independently verified. His confessions, the recovery of victims' remains, physical evidence connecting him to the crimes, and the discovery that he had given jewelry belonging to one victim to his girlfriend collectively formed a far stronger foundation than his inconsistent attempts to justify his actions. The defense presented a very different interpretation of Arthur Shawcross. His attorneys argued that significant psychological and neurological problems affected his behavior and diminished his responsibility for the murders. Among the issues raised were allegations of brain injury, dissociative disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and traumatic experiences during childhood. The defense also referred to claims that Shawcross himself had made over the years regarding abuse by his mother, bullying during childhood, and sexual abuse by his sister. However, these personal accounts had long been disputed. Family members either denied them or stated they could not verify that such events had occurred. Furthermore, investigators had documented numerous examples of Shawcross altering stories about his past depending on the circumstances. This history made it difficult to determine which aspects of his personal narrative, if any, accurately reflected reality. The prosecution did not deny that psychological evaluations formed part of the case. Instead, prosecutors argued that regardless of any personal difficulties Shawcross may have experienced, the evidence demonstrated that he understood the nature of his actions and was capable of making deliberate choices. They emphasized the organized manner in which he approached victims, transported them to isolated locations, killed them through strangulation, disposed of their bodies in remote areas, and repeatedly avoided detection for nearly 2 years. Such behavior, they argued, reflected planning and awareness rather than an inability to distinguish right from wrong. The prosecution also highlighted Shawcross's efforts to conceal his crimes by abandoning bodies in locations where environmental conditions would delay discovery and destroy evidence. Those actions suggested an understanding that his conduct was criminal and an attempt to avoid accountability. After considering the evidence presented by both sides, the jury ultimately concluded that Arthur Shawcross was legally responsible for his actions. In December 1990, he was convicted of 10 counts of second-degree murder in Monroe County. These convictions represented the central portion of the Rochester murder investigation and reflected months of painstaking work by detectives, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and numerous supporting personnel who had pieced together a case despite extraordinary investigative obstacles. Additional legal proceedings followed because not every homicide had occurred within the same jurisdiction. One remaining case fell under the authority of Wayne County. Rather than proceeding through another contested trial, Shawcross entered a guilty plea in that case. Together, the convictions and guilty plea ensured that every officially recognized murder connected to the Rochester investigation received legal resolution within the criminal justice system. The sentence imposed upon Shawcross reflected both the severity of the crimes and the determination that he should never again be released into society. He received a punishment equivalent to 250 years in prison in addition to life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole. Unlike the sentence imposed following the murders of Jack Owen Blake and Karen and Hill in 1972, there would be no future opportunity for release based upon institutional behavior or rehabilitation programs. The justice system had concluded that Arthur Shawcross would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. For many observers, the sentence represented more than punishment for the murders themselves. It also symbolized an acknowledgement of the catastrophic consequences that followed his earlier tahol. Families of the victims had endured losses that could never be repaired, but at minimum they now knew the man responsible would never again have the opportunity to harm anyone outside prison walls. Even after his convictions, Shawcross continued making claims that attracted public attention. He suggested that he might have killed many additional people during his military service or while living in other states. Such statements naturally generated interest because serial offenders occasionally confess to crimes beyond those already known to investigators. However, law enforcement agencies carefully examined these assertions and found no independent evidence confirming them. Researchers who studied the case reached similar conclusions regarding many of Shawcross's broader claims, because his history demonstrated repeated exaggeration, contradiction, and fabrication. Unsupported confessions could not be accepted as factual without corroborating evidence. Consequently, the officially recognized victim count remained 14. 2 children murdered in 1972 and 12 women killed in the Rochester area between 1988 and 1989. This distinction remains important in historical and legal discussions of the case. Responsible investigation requires separating verified evidence from unsupported statements, regardless of how dramatic those statements may appear. Arthur Shawcross remained incarcerated for the rest of his life. On November 10, 2008, he died after being transferred from prison to a hospital because of health complications. His death marked the end of his personal story, but it did not end the broader significance of the case. Long after his passing, Arthur Shawcross continues to be studied not because of any fascination with the offender himself, but because his crimes exposed multiple weaknesses within the criminal justice system. One of the most significant lessons concerns parole. Shawcross had previously been convicted in connection with the sexual assault and killing of 2 children. Yet after approximately 14 years, he was judged suitable for release. In retrospect, many legal scholars, investigators, and members of the public regarded that decision as a profound institutional failure. The case encouraged renewed discussion about how violent offenders should be evaluated before parole, particularly those with histories involving sexual violence and repeated acts of extreme aggression. Another enduring lesson involves the treatment of marginalized victims. Many of the women murdered in Rochester lived difficult lives marked by addiction, homelessness, or prostitution. Those circumstances contributed to delays in recognizing disappearances and slowed the realization that a serial killer was operating. The Shawcross investigation demonstrated how vulnerable populations can unintentionally become overlooked during the early stages of criminal investigations. Not because their lives mattered less, but because social instability complicates reporting, identification, and evidence collection. Modern investigators increasingly emphasize that every missing person deserves equal attention regardless of occupation, economic status, or personal struggles. Finally, the case illustrated the danger of relying too heavily on rigid assumptions about offender behavior. Investigators later concluded that excessive dependence on expected patterns of criminal conduct can delay recognition of a serial offender because violent criminals do not always repeat every aspect of previous crimes in identical ways. Careful analysis requires flexibility, cooperation across jurisdictions, and a willingness to reconsider initial assumptions as new evidence emerges. Today, the story of Arthur Shawcross remains one of the most extensively studied serial murder cases in American criminal justice. Yet the most important legacy does not belong to the man whose name became infamous. It belongs to Jack Owen Blake, Karen and Hill, Dorothy Blackburn, Anna Marie Steffen, Dorothy Keeler, Patricia Ives, June Stott, Marie Welch, Frances Brown, Kimberly Logan, Elizabeth Gibson, Darlene Trippi, June Cicero, and Felicia Stevens. Their lives, rather than the notoriety of the offender, remain the true reason this case continues to be remembered. More than 3 decades have passed since Arthur John Shawcross was taken into custody, yet his case continues to occupy a significant place in the study of violent crime, criminal justice, and offender management in the United States. Unlike many notorious serial murder cases that remain surrounded by unanswered questions, the Shawcross investigation reached a clear legal conclusion through arrests, confessions, forensic evidence, and courtroom proceedings. What has endured is not uncertainty about the offender's identity, but continued examination of how a man previously convicted in connection with the killings of 2 children was released and allowed to kill again. For criminologists, psychologists, prosecutors, and law enforcement professionals, the case remains less a mystery than a cautionary example of how multiple institutional weaknesses can intersect with devastating consequences. One of the most frequently discussed aspects of the case is the parole decision made in 1987. At the time, correctional officials evaluated Shawcross according to the standards and information available to them. His institutional record indicated generally acceptable behavior, and he had participated in rehabilitation programs during his incarceration. Those factors contributed to the conclusion that he could safely return to society after serving approximately 14 years of a sentence carrying a maximum of 25 years. Looking back after the Rochester murders, however, that decision became the subject of intense criticism. Commentators questioned whether sufficient weight had been given to the nature of his original crimes. Shawcross had sexually assaulted and killed 2 children, offenses involving extraordinary violence against highly vulnerable victims. Some mental health professionals had reportedly warned that he displayed characteristics associated with psychopathy and represented a continuing risk. Although parole decisions always require balancing public safety with the possibility of rehabilitation, the Shawcross case demonstrated how difficult and how consequential that judgment can become when dealing with offenders who have committed severe acts of interpersonal violence. The case also transformed discussions surrounding the evaluation of dangerous offenders. Prison behavior, while important, occurs within a highly structured environment where daily routines, movement, and interpersonal interactions are carefully controlled. Critics argued that success inside prison does not necessarily predict safe behavior after release, when supervision is reduced and opportunities to offend return. Shawcross's apparent adjustment to institutional life contrasted sharply with his conduct after regaining freedom. Within roughly a year of his release, investigators concluded that he had resumed killing. This sequence of events became one reason many criminal justice experts later advocated for more comprehensive risk assessments that consider not only institutional conduct, but also the specific characteristics of prior offenses, patterns of violence, and long-term behavioral indicators. Another enduring lesson concerns the investigation itself. Detectives working the Rochester murders faced extraordinary challenges from the beginning. Many victims disappeared gradually over an extended period rather than within a single concentrated time frame. Their bodies were frequently discovered only after exposure to weather, wildlife, flowing water, and natural decomposition had destroyed valuable forensic evidence. Several victims also lived unstable lives shaped by addiction, homelessness, or prostitution. These circumstances complicated missing person investigations because temporary absences were unfortunately not unusual, delaying recognition that serious crimes had occurred. The Shawcross investigation illustrated how serial offenders sometimes exploit existing social vulnerabilities rather than creating them. Investigators later concluded that Shawcross deliberately targeted women whose disappearances might not receive immediate public attention. This observation has influenced later discussions regarding the importance of treating every missing person report with urgency regardless of the victim's occupation, housing status, or personal struggles. Modern investigative philosophy increasingly emphasizes that vulnerable populations deserve the same commitment and resources as every other member of society, recognizing that offenders may intentionally seek victims whom they believe will be overlooked. Equally significant was the realization that behavioral assumptions alone cannot solve complex investigations. Early in the Rochester murders, detectives understandably examined each homicide individually because the available evidence did not yet establish clear connections. As more victims were discovered, however, broader patterns gradually emerged involving victim characteristics, methods of killing, and body disposal sites near the Genesee River and surrounding waterways. The investigation demonstrated both the value and the limitations of behavioral analysis. While identifying common patterns eventually helped unify the cases, investigators also recognized that excessive dependence on rigid expectations regarding offender behavior can delay recognition of serial crimes. Criminal offenders do not always repeat identical actions in every offense, and successful investigations require flexibility alongside careful analysis. Cooperation across multiple jurisdictions became another important element of the case. Several victims were discovered in different counties, meaning that no single agency initially possessed the complete picture. As detectives began sharing information more systematically, patterns became increasingly apparent. The Shawcross investigation reinforced the importance of communication between law enforcement agencies when crimes crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Later criminal investigations throughout the United States increasingly emphasized centralized information sharing and coordinated task forces when evidence suggested serial offending. The role of confessions in the case also offers valuable lessons. After his arrest, Shawcross eventually admitted responsibility for most of the murders and provided investigators with extensive statements, including information that helped clarify aspects of the investigation. Nevertheless, detectives consistently treated his admissions with caution. Throughout both the investigation and his public interviews, Shawcross repeatedly changed explanations for his actions, contradicted earlier statements, and made numerous claims that could not be independently verified. This pattern extended beyond the murders themselves. He offered varying accounts of childhood abuse, military experiences, and alleged additional killings. Researchers examining his military record found that many dramatic stories he told regarding combat lacked documentary support. Similarly, law enforcement agencies found no independent evidence confirming his later assertions that he had committed numerous additional murders beyond the officially recognized victims. As a result, investigators relied upon corroborated evidence rather than accepting unsupported confessions at face value. This cautious approach reflected an important principle of criminal investigation. A confession gains evidentiary value when supported by independent facts, not merely because it exists. Arthur Shawcross died on November 10, 2008, after being transferred from prison to a hospital due to health complications. He remained incarcerated until his death, never again returning to society after his 1990 convictions. His death closed the legal chapter of the case, but it did not diminish its historical significance. Instead, the focus increasingly shifted away from the offender himself and toward the broader lessons revealed by the investigation. Today, discussions of Arthur Shawcross often emphasize institutional accountability rather than personal notoriety. His crimes demonstrated how failures within separate systems can reinforce one another. Limited forensic capabilities affected the prosecution of the 1972 child murders. Parole decisions underestimated future risk despite concerns expressed by some professionals. The vulnerable circumstances of later victims contributed to delays in recognizing a serial pattern. Environmental conditions complicated forensic recovery after bodies were abandoned near waterways and wooded areas. None of these factors alone caused the Rochester murders, but together they created opportunities that Shawcross exploited repeatedly until investigators finally identified him through persistent surveillance and coordinated police work. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Shawcross case lies in its reminder that every victim deserves equal recognition regardless of social status. The women murdered in Rochester were often described primarily through the hardships they experienced: addiction, homelessness, or prostitution. Yet those descriptions never defined the entirety of their lives. They were individuals whose absences were deeply felt by families, friends, and communities. Remembering them solely as members of a vulnerable population risks repeating the very oversight that allowed their disappearances initially to attract less attention than they deserved. The lasting value of studying this case therefore extends beyond understanding one serial killer. It lies in recognizing the importance of protecting those most vulnerable to violence, improving investigative cooperation, strengthening offender risk assessment, and ensuring that the pursuit of justice remains equally determined regardless of who the victim may be. Arthur Shawcross's name has become permanently associated with one of America's most infamous serial murder investigations. But history is better served when the focus remains on the lives that were lost, the institutional lessons that were learned, and the continuing responsibility to prevent similar tragedies from occurring again. The story of Arthur John Shawcross remains one of the most deeply examined criminal cases in American history because it represents more than the actions of one violent offender. It is a case that forces difficult questions about justice, rehabilitation, public safety, and the ways society responds to victims whose lives exist outside the attention of the mainstream. While the name Genesee River Killer became widely recognized because of the crimes committed in Rochester, the full story begins long before the riverbanks became crime scenes. It begins with the lives of 14 victims, with 2 children whose deaths should have marked the end of Shawcross's ability to harm others, and with the decisions that allowed him to eventually return to society. The consequences of those decisions would not become clear until years later, when the city of Rochester found itself facing one of the most disturbing serial murder investigations in New York State history. Looking back at Shawcross's criminal history, one of the most significant patterns is the repeated targeting of vulnerable individuals. His first confirmed victims were children: 10-year-old Jack Owen Blake and 8-year-old Karen and Hill. They were young, trusting, and unable to defend themselves against an adult who used that trust to commit unimaginable acts of violence. 16 years later, the majority of his Rochester victims were women living difficult and unstable lives. Many struggled with addiction, homelessness, or relied on prostitution for survival. These circumstances did not make them less valuable. Instead, they made them easier targets for someone seeking victims who might not immediately receive widespread attention. The investigation into Shawcross demonstrated a painful reality. Criminals can exploit social vulnerabilities, and when victims are already marginalized, their disappearances may not immediately receive the urgency they deserve. Each woman killed by Shawcross had a life beyond the circumstances that investigators later used to identify patterns. They had personal histories, relationships, memories, and people who cared about them. The danger of focusing too heavily on the offender is that the victims can become reduced to numbers within a criminal timeline. However, the true human cost of the Shawcross case is measured not by the notoriety of the man responsible, but by the 14 lives that ended because of his actions. Dorothy Blackburn, Anna Marie Steffen, Dorothy Keeler, Patricia Ives, June Stott, Marie Welch, Frances Brown, Kimberly Logan, Elizabeth Gibson, Darlene Trippi, June Cicero, and Felicia Stevens were not simply names in an investigation file. They were individuals whose deaths left permanent wounds in their families and communities. The same is true for Jack Blake and Karen Hill, whose childhoods were taken away before they had the opportunity to grow into adulthood. Another important aspect of the Shawcross case is the challenge of understanding offender behavior, without allowing explanations to become excuses. Throughout his life, Shawcross offered many explanations for his actions. He described a troubled childhood, claimed experiences of abuse, and suggested that traumatic events influenced his behavior. He also made dramatic statements about his military experiences and alleged acts that investigators could not verify. Mental health issues were raised during his trial, including claims involving brain injury, dissociation, and psychological disorders. These factors became part of the legal debate over his responsibility. However, the court ultimately determined that Shawcross understood his actions and was capable of being held accountable for them. This distinction remains important. Understanding why a crime occurs can help improve prevention and treatment. But explanation does not erase responsibility for deliberate acts of violence. The legal proceedings surrounding Shawcross also reveal the difficulties faced by criminal justice systems when dealing with offenders who have committed severe crimes. His first conviction resulted in a maximum sentence of 25 years. Yet he served approximately 14 years before being released on parole. At the time, officials believed he had demonstrated enough progress to return safely to society. Years later, after the Rochester murders, that judgment became one of the most criticized decisions connected to the case. The question was not simply whether mistakes had been made, but whether the methods used to evaluate dangerous offenders were capable of accurately measuring future risk. Shawcross became a case study in the limitations of predicting human behavior. No system can perfectly determine whether someone will commit future violence, but the consequences of inaccurate assessments can be devastating. The investigation that eventually led to Shawcross's arrest demonstrated the importance of persistence and cooperation. Detectives faced significant obstacles, including damaged evidence, multiple crime scenes, and victims whose disappearances were not immediately recognized as connected. Yet through careful comparison of cases, surveillance efforts, and attention to patterns, investigators gradually narrowed the search. The turning point came when police observed Shawcross near an area connected to a recently discovered victim. His vehicle identification led investigators to his identity, and his previous criminal history immediately transformed him from a person of interest into a major suspect. The subsequent confession and discovery of additional evidence confirmed what investigators had feared. The same man previously convicted of killing children had become responsible for another series of murders. The case also demonstrated why law enforcement must maintain caution when dealing with offender statements. Shawcross was capable of providing accurate information, including details that helped investigators locate evidence and clarify aspects of the crimes. At the same time, He frequently altered his explanations and offered statements that could not be verified. This mixture of truth and deception created a challenge for investigators. They had to separate useful information from manipulation. The lesson remains relevant in modern criminal investigations. Statements from offenders must always be evaluated against independent evidence. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the Shawcross case is the discussion it created about justice for victims who are often ignored. The women murdered in Rochester belong to a population frequently affected by social stigma. Because of that stigma, their deaths initially did not receive the same level of attention that might have surrounded victims from more socially protected backgrounds. The investigation revealed how dangerous such assumptions can be. Every person reported missing represents a potential victim, regardless of occupation, economic status, or personal history. Criminal justice systems depend on recognizing that principle in practice, not merely acknowledging it in theory. The case also changed how many people viewed serial murder investigations. Before Shawcross, investigators often relied heavily on the idea that serial offenders followed consistent behavioral patterns. However, Shawcross demonstrated that offenders can vary their methods, select different victim groups, and avoid detection by operating within gaps created by limited information. His crimes reinforce the importance of examining broader patterns rather than waiting for every detail to match previous cases perfectly. More than 30 years after his arrest, Arthur Shawcross remains a subject of study not because his actions deserve fascination, but because the case provides important lessons about prevention and accountability. The focus should never be on celebrating the offender's notoriety. Instead, the focus should remain on understanding failures, improving systems, and honoring those who were lost. The story of the Genesee River Killer is ultimately a story about consequences. It is about the consequences of releasing a dangerous offender without fully understanding the risks. It is about the consequences suffered by families who lost loved ones. It is about the consequences faced by communities when vulnerable people are overlooked. And it is about the responsibility of society to learn from tragedy. Arthur Shawcross died in prison in 2008, but the questions raised by his crimes continue to influence discussions about criminal justice today. His case remains a reminder that behind every statistic is a human life. And behind every investigation file are families who must continue living with the aftermath of violence. The most meaningful way to remember this case is not through the name of the killer, but through the names and lives of the victims who deserve far more than to become chapters in someone else's criminal history. The case of Arthur John Shawcross continues to be examined decades after his conviction because it represents a complicated intersection of individual violence and systemic failure. While the crimes themselves are shocking, the deeper significance of the case lies in the questions that followed. How could a person convicted of murdering children later return to society and kill again? How should authorities evaluate whether a violent offender has truly changed? How can investigators ensure that victims from vulnerable communities receive the same urgency and attention as anyone else? These questions remain relevant because the circumstances surrounding the Shawcross case are not limited to one individual or one period of history. They reflect broader challenges faced by criminal justice systems everywhere. When Arthur Shawcross was released from prison in 1987, the decision was based on the information and evaluation methods available at the time. His behavior while incarcerated suggested to officials that he had adapted to prison life and might no longer represent the same danger he had once posed. He had participated in rehabilitation programs, followed institutional rules, and avoided violent incidents while under supervision. To those responsible for evaluating his release, these factors indicated progress. However, the Rochester murders revealed a critical weakness in that assessment. A person's ability to follow rules in a controlled prison environment does not necessarily demonstrate that they can safely function in an unrestricted society. Prison removes many of the opportunities and circumstances that allow violent behavior to occur. Outside prison walls, offenders face choices, access to potential victims, and situations that cannot be replicated during incarceration. The tragedy of Shawcross's later crimes forced officials and experts to reconsider how rehabilitation should be measured, especially for offenders convicted of extreme violence. The case became a symbol of the difficulty involved in predicting future dangerousness. Risk assessment is not a perfect science. Mental health professionals, parole boards, and correctional officials must make decisions using available information. Yet, even careful evaluations can fail to predict future actions. In Shawcross's situation, critics argued that too much emphasis had been placed on his prison behavior, while insufficient attention had been given to the severity and nature of his earlier crimes. The murders of Jack Blake and Karen Hill were not isolated acts of minor violence. They involved sexual assault, the killing of children, and behavior that demonstrated a serious level of cruelty. For many observers, those factors should have remained central when determining whether he could safely return to society. The Rochester murders also changed public understanding of how serial killers can operate. Before investigators identified Shawcross, the disappearances of women around Rochester did not immediately reveal a single pattern. Each missing person case had its own circumstances, and many victims lived lives that made delayed reporting more common. Some had unstable housing situations, some struggled with addiction, and many were involved in prostitution. These realities created investigative challenges, not because their lives mattered less, but because their circumstances made it harder for authorities to quickly determine when a crime had occurred. Shawcross exploited those difficulties. He selected victims whose disappearances might not immediately create public pressure or intensive searches. This aspect of the case contributed to later efforts to improve how law enforcement agencies respond to missing persons from marginalized communities. The investigation emphasized that every disappearance requires serious attention, regardless of a victim's background. The women killed by Shawcross were often described through the hardships they experienced, but those descriptions represent only one part of their stories. Their lives were not defined by addiction, poverty, or prostitution. They were individuals with personal histories and relationships. The investigation eventually focused on their deaths, but their existence before those crimes deserves equal recognition. Understanding this point is essential because one of the greatest dangers in studying criminal cases is allowing the offender's actions to overshadow the humanity of the victims. The name of the killer may become widely known, but the lives lost should remain the center of the story. The investigative process itself also provided important lessons. Detectives working on the Rochester murders faced significant obstacles because the crimes occurred over an extended period and across multiple locations. The disposal of bodies near the Genesee River and surrounding areas created additional difficulties. Weather, water, wildlife, and decomposition damaged evidence and limited what forensic specialists could recover. Without modern forensic technology, investigators had to rely heavily on traditional methods: careful observation, witness accounts, victim profiles, surveillance, and cooperation between agencies. Their eventual success demonstrated the importance of patience and persistence in complex investigations. The arrest of Shawcross was not the result of one single piece of evidence, but rather the accumulation of many investigative efforts working together. The discovery of his vehicle near a location connected to a homicide became a turning point, but it only mattered because detectives had already spent months building a broader understanding of the crimes. They recognized patterns, monitored locations, and remained focused despite uncertainty. The case showed that major investigations are often solved through gradual progress rather than one dramatic breakthrough. Another significant lesson involves the careful handling of offender confessions. After his arrest, Shawcross provided extensive information about the murders, but his statements required careful examination. He was known to change his explanations and provide conflicting accounts about various parts of his life and criminal behavior. Investigators understood that a confession alone could not replace evidence. They compared his statements with physical findings, confirmed details where possible, and rejected claims that lacked support. This approach prevented the investigation from being controlled by Shawcross's own attempts to shape the narrative. His willingness to speak did not mean that every statement was truthful. In fact, separating fact from manipulation became one of the central challenges in understanding him. The trial also highlighted the complicated relationship between mental health and criminal responsibility. The defense presented arguments involving psychological conditions, brain injury, trauma, and other factors that might have influenced Shawcross's behavior. These issues were considered within the legal process, but the jury ultimately determined that he remained responsible for his actions. The outcome reflected a fundamental principle of criminal law. Mental health conditions may be relevant when evaluating a person's behavior, but they do not automatically remove accountability. Courts must examine whether an individual understood their actions and whether they were capable of making choices. In Shawcross's case, the jury concluded that he met the standard for criminal responsibility. Following his convictions, Shawcross received a sentence designed to ensure that he would never again be released. The punishment represented not only accountability for the Rochester murders, but also recognition of the irreversible harm caused to every victim and family affected. His death in 2008, while still incarcerated, ended any possibility of future proceedings. But the broader discussion surrounding his case continued. The impact of the Shawcross case extends beyond one offender, one city, or one era. It changed conversations about parole decisions, offender assessment, victim recognition, and investigative coordination. It demonstrated that criminal justice decisions made years earlier can have consequences that are impossible to predict fully. It also reinforced the responsibility of institutions to continuously examine and improve their methods. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Genesee River Killer case is that prevention requires attention to every part of the system. It requires accurate evaluation of dangerous offenders, careful investigation of missing persons, respect for all victims, and willingness to learn from failures. The case remains a reminder that justice is not only about punishing those who commit crimes after they occur. It is also about creating systems capable of reducing the chance that such crimes happen again. Arthur Shawcross's name remains associated with tragedy, but the lasting significance of the case belongs to the lessons drawn from it. The victims' lives, the families affected, and the changes inspired by the investigation represent the true legacy of the case. Remembering those lessons is the most meaningful way to ensure that the suffering caused by these crimes contributes to a safer future. The story of Arthur John Shawcross is often remembered through the disturbing title attached to him, the Genesee River Killer. That name became associated with a series of murders that shocked Rochester, New York, and captured national attention. However, behind the label and behind the criminal investigation was a much larger story involving victims, families, investigators, and a justice system forced to confront uncomfortable questions. The final chapters of the Shawcross case are not only about the crimes themselves, but also about how society chooses to remember tragedy and what lessons can be taken from the lives that were lost. When examining the aftermath of the case, it becomes clear that the impact extended far beyond the courtroom. The victims' families were left with permanent losses that no conviction could repair. A prison sentence could hold Arthur Shawcross accountable, but it could never restore the lives that had been taken. For relatives of the victims, justice was not measured only by the length of a sentence. It was also found in recognition, in knowing the truth about what happened, and in seeing the person responsible prevented from harming others again. The conclusion of the trial brought legal resolution, but emotional healing was far more complicated. The families of Dorothy Blackburn, Anna Marie Steffen, Dorothy Keeler, Patricia Ives, June Stott, Marie Welch, Frances Brown, Kimberly Logan, Elizabeth Gibson, Darlene Trippi, June Cicero, And Felicia Stevens carried the consequences of Shawcross's actions long after the investigation ended. Their loved ones were remembered through personal memories rather than through the circumstances of their deaths. This distinction is important because criminal cases often focus heavily on the offender's behavior, creating the risk that victims become secondary characters in their own stories. The Shawcross case demonstrates why that perspective must be challenged. The victims were not simply elements in a serial murder investigation. They were individuals whose lives existed before the crimes committed against them. The same applies to Jack Blake and Karen Hill, the two children murdered in 1972. Their deaths represented the beginning of Shawcross's known pattern of violence, and their cases remained a crucial part of understanding the later events in Rochester. Had the criminal justice system reached a different conclusion in the 1970s, history might have unfolded differently. That possibility became one of the most painful questions surrounding the case. The decision to allow Shawcross to eventually return to society became a defining issue in discussions about the effectiveness of parole. Critics argued that the original crimes should have been given greater weight when evaluating his future risk. Supporters of the original decision pointed out that parole boards must make judgments based on available evidence and that rehabilitation assessments are inherently difficult. The controversy surrounding Shawcross did not produce simple answers, but it did encourage broader examination of how violent offenders are evaluated. One of the major changes in thinking after cases like Shawcross's was the recognition that risk assessment requires a comprehensive approach. Institutional behavior, while relevant, cannot be considered in isolation. Evaluators must consider the full history of violence, the nature of previous offenses, psychological evaluations, patterns of behavior, and other factors that may indicate future danger. The Shawcross case became an example frequently discussed when examining the limitations of relying too heavily on positive prison adjustment as evidence of rehabilitation. The investigation also left a lasting influence on how authorities view vulnerable victims. Many of the women killed in Rochester came from circumstances that placed them at increased risk. Their involvement in prostitution, struggles with addiction, or unstable living conditions affected how quickly their disappearances were recognized and investigated. This reality exposed a serious challenge within criminal justice systems, ensuring that every person receives equal attention and protection regardless of social position. A person's occupation, addiction history, or economic situation should never determine the value placed on their life. The women murdered by Shawcross deserve the same urgency, compassion, and commitment that would be expected for any missing person. Their stories helped reinforce the importance of examining bias and assumptions within investigations. A missing person report is not simply a piece of paperwork. It represents a person whose absence has meaning and whose safety matters. The Shawcross investigation also influenced how law enforcement agencies approach suspected serial offenders. Detectives learned that connections between crimes may not always be immediately obvious. Victims may differ in certain ways, crime scenes may vary, and evidence may be incomplete. Investigators must therefore remain open to emerging patterns rather than waiting for every detail to fit a perfect profile. The Rochester murders demonstrated how important cooperation between agencies can be when crimes cross jurisdictional boundaries. Information sharing allowed investigators to see connections that might have remained hidden if each case had been considered separately. The case further illustrated the importance of balancing behavioral analysis with physical evidence. Understanding offender patterns can help guide investigations, but it cannot replace careful examination of facts. Shawcross himself demonstrated why caution is necessary. He provided information that assisted investigators, but he also made statements that were inconsistent or impossible to verify. His tendency to alter explanations showed that offenders may attempt to influence how their actions are understood. Investigators must therefore maintain a clear separation between what is proven and what is merely claimed. The final years of Shawcross's life were spent in prison. After receiving a sentence that ensured he would not return to society, he remained incarcerated until his death on November 10, 2008. His passing received attention because of the notoriety of his crimes, but it did not change the facts established through the investigation and trial. He died having been held accountable for 14 confirmed murders. However, the conclusion of his life did not erase the broader significance of the case. The questions raised by Shawcross continue because they involve challenges that remain relevant. How can dangerous offenders be accurately evaluated? How can communities better protect vulnerable individuals? How can investigators identify patterns before more victims are harmed? These questions extend beyond one criminal and one investigation. They represent ongoing responsibilities within society. The Shawcross case also serves as a reminder of the importance of separating curiosity about offenders from respect for victims. True crime investigations often attract public attention because they involve extreme behavior and difficult questions about human nature. However, the purpose of studying such cases should not be to glorify criminals or transform them into figures of fascination. The purpose should be to understand failures, improve systems, and remember those who suffered. Arthur Shawcross became famous because of the harm he caused, but the lasting lessons of the case come from the people whose lives were affected and from the changes inspired by the investigation. The most responsible way to remember the Genesee River Killer case is to place the victims at the center. Their names represent real people whose futures were stolen. Their families represent the lasting consequences of violence. The investigation represents the dedication of those who worked to uncover the truth. The legal proceedings represent society's attempt to hold offenders accountable. And the lessons learned represent an obligation to do better in the future. The story of Arthur Shawcross remains disturbing because it reveals how many opportunities existed for tragedy to occur. It shows the danger of incomplete assessments, delayed recognition, and social vulnerabilities being exploited by someone willing to commit extreme violence. But it also demonstrates the importance of persistence, cooperation, and accountability. The case continues to be studied not because of the man who committed these crimes, but because of what can be learned from them. In the end, the legacy of the Genesee River Killer should not be defined by the person who caused the suffering. It should be defined by the victims who deserve justice, the families who endured loss, and the continued effort to build systems capable of preventing similar tragedies. The case of Arthur John Shawcross reaches its conclusion not with the disappearance of questions, but with a deeper understanding of the responsibilities that remain after a tragedy. The crimes committed by Shawcross between 1972 and 1989 created wounds that extended far beyond the dates of the murders themselves. His victims were gone, their families were left with unimaginable grief, and communities were forced to confront the reality that a person previously convicted of horrific violence had been allowed to return to society. Yet the importance of studying this case is not found in the actions of the offender alone. It lies in understanding the failures, the investigative challenges, and the human cost behind one of the most significant serial murder cases in American criminal history. Arthur Shawcross died on November 10, 2008, while still serving his sentence. His death marked the end of his ability to directly affect the outside world. But it did not erase the consequences of his actions. The official record of 14 confirmed victims remained. 2 children murdered in 1972 and 12 women killed during the Rochester crime series between 1988 and 1989. Each of those victims represented an individual life interrupted by violence. Their stories became connected through the investigation, but they existed separately before they became part of a criminal case. Remembering that distinction is essential when examining cases involving serial offenders. The identity of the perpetrator often dominates public attention, while the victims risk becoming secondary. The tragedy of the Shawcross case is not simply that a serial killer operated for years without being stopped. It is also that 14 people lost their lives and countless others were forced to live with the consequences. The first warning signs of Shawcross's capacity for violence appeared decades before the Rochester murders. In 1972, the killings of Jack, Owen Blake, and Karen and Hill demonstrated the extreme danger he posed. These were not crimes that resulted from a momentary mistake or accidental harm. They involved the deliberate targeting of children, sexual violence, and attempts to conceal the evidence. The legal outcome of those cases became one of the most controversial aspects of Shawcross's history. Through a plea agreement, he received a conviction for manslaughter rather than a murder conviction for the crimes, and he was eventually released after serving approximately 14 years. That decision became central to later criticism because the Rochester murders revealed that the assessment of his future risk had failed. The consequences of that failure were devastating. When Shawcross moved to Rochester after his release, he was able to present himself as someone who had rebuilt his life. He married again, worked ordinary jobs, and appeared to be living a normal existence. However, beneath that appearance, the violence had returned. The women who disappeared around Rochester became the next victims of a pattern that investigators would only fully understand after multiple lives had already been lost. The investigation demonstrated how difficult it can be to identify a serial offender when victims come from vulnerable communities. Many of the Rochester victims were involved in prostitution, struggled with addiction, or experienced unstable living conditions. These circumstances affected how quickly authorities could recognize the seriousness of their disappearances. Their cases initially appeared separate, and there was no immediate indication that a single offender was responsible. This delay gave Shawcross additional opportunities to continue his crimes. The eventual discovery of the pattern represented months of investigative work rather than one simple breakthrough. Detectives had to overcome limited forensic evidence, multiple crime scenes, and jurisdictional challenges. Bodies were found in areas connected to the Genesee River and surrounding locations. But environmental conditions often damaged evidence. Weather, water, wildlife, and decomposition made reconstruction difficult. Investigators could not depend solely on physical evidence, so they relied on careful comparison of cases, surveillance, witness information, and cooperation between agencies. The arrest of Shawcross in January 1990 demonstrated the importance of persistence. Police surveillance near a location connected to a recent discovery led them to observe a man acting suspiciously. The vehicle associated with that individual was traced, revealing the identity of Arthur Shawcross. His previous conviction immediately made him a significant suspect. After his arrest, his statements provided investigators with additional information. But those statements required careful evaluation because Shawcross frequently changed his explanations. He offered different accounts of his motivations and attempted to present alternative interpretations of his actions. Investigators understood that his words could not be accepted without confirmation. They relied on evidence, not simply on what he claimed. This approach became a significant part of building a successful prosecution. During the trial, the defense attempted to explain Shawcross's behavior through psychological and neurological factors. His attorneys raised issues involving brain injury, trauma, and mental health conditions. The prosecution acknowledged that these issues had been considered but argued that Shawcross remained responsible because he understood his actions and demonstrated awareness through his attempts to conceal the crimes. After reviewing the evidence, the jury concluded that he was legally responsible. His convictions ensured that he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. The sentence represented a final legal judgment, but it did not resolve all the broader issues raised by the case. One of the most important consequences of the Shawcross investigation was the renewed discussion about parole and offender evaluation. His case became a frequently cited example of the challenges involved in determining whether a violent offender can safely return to society. It showed that rehabilitation is complex and that positive behavior in prison does not always indicate that a person no longer poses a threat. The case encouraged further consideration of how criminal histories, psychological evaluations, and patterns of violence should influence release decisions. Another lasting lesson involved the recognition of marginalized victims. The women killed by Shawcross were sometimes overlooked because of the circumstances of their lives. Their cases demonstrated that social status should never determine the seriousness with which a disappearance is treated. Every victim deserves attention, every family deserves answers, and every life deserves recognition. The tragedy of the Rochester murders highlighted the importance of ensuring that vulnerable populations receive equal protection under the law. The case also changed how many investigators think about serial crimes. Offenders do not always behave according to predictable patterns. They may alter methods, select different victims, or exploit weaknesses in society and investigative systems. The Shawcross murders reinforced the need for flexible analysis, information sharing, and cooperation between agencies. Detectives must be willing to reconsider assumptions as new evidence emerges. A case may appear fragmented at first, but careful examination can reveal connections that are not immediately visible. More than 30 years after Shawcross's arrest, his crimes continue to be studied because they reveal uncomfortable truths about justice and human behavior. They demonstrate that preventing future violence requires more than identifying offenders after crimes occur. It requires stronger systems for evaluating risk, better responses to missing persons cases, and continued commitment to protecting those most vulnerable to exploitation. However, the most important lesson remains the need to remember the victims. The history of Arthur Shawcross should not be preserved as a story about a famous killer. It should be preserved as a reminder of the people whose lives were taken and of the responsibility to learn from their deaths. Jack Blake and Karen Hill were children who should have had futures ahead of them. Dorothy Blackburn, Anna Marie Steffen, Dorothy Keeler, Patricia Ives, June Stott, Marie Welch, Frances Brown, Kimberly Logan, Elizabeth Gibson, Darlene Trippi, June Cicero, and Felicia Stevens were women whose lives contained far more than the circumstances surrounding their deaths. Their identities should not be overshadowed by the actions of the man who harmed them. The final meaning of the Shawcross case is found not in the notoriety of the offender, but in the lessons left behind. It is a reminder that decisions made within justice systems can have consequences far into the future. It is a reminder that every victim deserves recognition and protection. It is a reminder that investigations require patience, cooperation, and attention to patterns that may not immediately be obvious. And above all, it is a reminder that behind every criminal case are human beings whose lives mattered. Arthur Shawcross spent the final years of his life in prison for the crimes he committed. The legal process reached its conclusion, but the responsibility to remember and learn continues. The true legacy of the Genesee River Killer case belongs not to the man whose name became infamous, but to the victims whose lives were lost and to the ongoing effort to ensure that similar tragedies are prevented in the future.